The scanner beeped 3 times, then went silent, then beeped again. Long, sustained, like something confused by what it was reading. Nyel Corven froze, his mop handle pressed against his ribs, his cleaning cart half inside the service elevator. Sol standing beside him, for years old, one small fist gripping the side of Nyel's uniform pants. The scanner above the executive entrance, the one that had never once acknowledged Nyel's badge in 2 years, blinked green.
The doors opened. Not the service entrance doors, the executive ones. The tall ones with the brushed chrome handles and the Arkavale Logistics crest etched above the frame. Nyel didn't move. Sol did. The boy took one slow step forward, then another. His sneakers made no sound on the marble. The lobby, empty at 2:47 in the morning, absorbed him the way expensive rooms absorb everything. Quietly, like it expected him. Sol. Nyel's voice came out low. Careful. Sol looked back. Those green eyes steady. Unbothered. That was always the thing about Sol. He was never bothered by things that should have bothered him. Nyel grabbed his son's hand and pulled it back to the cart. He pressed his own badge against the scanner. Denied. Same as always. He checked the service door, propped open on the right like it was every Tuesday night. He went through it. He always went through it. That was the whole point of his life. Going through the doors that were made for people like him.
The executive elevator stood open behind them both. Nyel looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he walked away. He mopped the 14th floor in 47 minutes. He used the unscented solution on the marble near the guest suites. Mr. Halloway in 14C had complained twice about the lemon formula and once had called building management at 11 p.m. to report a chemical smell that turned out to be entirely in his imagination. But still, Nyel remembered. He stacked the fresh linens outside 14A without being asked because Mrs. Diaz left hers bundled every 3rd Tuesday. Tied with a pale blue ribbon she seemed to own an infinite supply of, and housekeeping never caught it before morning rounds because housekeeping came at 7 and Nyel was gone by 4. He knew this building the way you know a place you've been inside 1,000 times in the dark. Every floor, every pattern, the sound the 7th floor elevator made at the end of its cable. A low groan, like something tired, every time the cab descended. The section of marble on 9 that was slightly cooler than the rest because of a drain problem 2 floors up that had been filed and refiled with maintenance for 8 months. The way the air changed between the east wing and the west wing on 12, drier on the east, something to do with the HVAC orientation. He knew all of it. That was what people like Nyel were allowed to know. Not names, not faces, not stories, habits, patterns. The operational details of other people's lives from the underside. The building knew him too in the way buildings know the people who maintain them. Not with warmth, just with routine. The door codes that worked for his badge. The service access points. The hours he was permitted on which floors. The elevator he was expected to use. The executive elevator, the one that had stood open while Sol walked toward it at 2:47 in the morning, was not one of them. Sol sat in the supply alcove off the main hall, the one tucked behind the fire door where Nyel kept a folded blanket and 2 juice boxes and a picture book about trains. The boy had memorized it months ago. He read it anyway, lips moving slightly, one finger tracing the rails on each page. The same rails, the same curves, the way a person returns to a thing not because they don't know it but because knowing it is its own kind of comfort. Nyel passed the alcove 6 times in 47 minutes. Each time he passed, he looked. Each time Sol looked back. That exchange was the whole of it. A glance. A confirmation. You're there. I'm here, we're okay. It had to be enough. He'd learned early, real early, that needing more than what was given turned into a kind of bleeding. Slow. Invisible. The kind that didn't leave marks but still emptied you out over the years until you woke up one morning and realized the emptiness was just your baseline now. And you'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the sound of traffic when you live near a highway long enough. Hi viewers, if you had to choose between staying invisible to survive or being seen and risking everything you've built, which would you choose? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to read every single one. Around 3:15 a.m. resident on 14 came out of her suite. Robe, no shoes, sleep-creased face. She stopped when she saw Nyel. Her eyes moved to the cart. then to him, then to the hall behind him like she was checking for someone else. "Did you go into my unit?" she said. "No, ma'am. Someone moved my bag. I've been in the hall, ma'am. I haven't entered any units tonight." She studied him for another few seconds. The way people study something they've already made a decision about but want to feel fair doing it. "I'm calling the front desk," she said. Nyel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He kept his face steady. He kept his hands on the cart. He kept his voice exactly where it needed to be, low enough to not be a threat, clear enough to not be dismissed. He had learned all the distances. Every single one. She went back inside. She didn't call. She never did. But the threat itself was the point. The point was that he should feel it, the implication of it, so that the next night he came in to clean her floor, the implication was still sitting in his body somewhere and making him quieter, more careful, more aware of his own edges. It worked. It always worked. Nyel breathed through it. He had a specific internal technique, nothing dramatic, nothing taught to him by anyone, just a practiced shift of attention. He moved it from what just happened to what was next. The next floor. The next pass. The next thing. The gap between what someone did to you and what you were going to do about it, closed by the decision to simply move forward. That decision, made several thousand times over 14 years, had kept him employed. He pushed his cart to the service elevator. Wrote it down. The cable groaned on the way. He had heard that groan so many times it was almost companionable. Sol was already asleep when he got back to the alcove, curled on his side. The train book open across his chest, spine up, pages pressed flat. The boy had no patience for bookmarks and had never bent a spine in 4 years, and Nyel had never figured out how he managed both of those things simultaneously. He sat on the cold floor beside him. He put one hand lightly on the boy's chest. Over the heartbeat. He did not press. Just contact. The steady mechanical fact of a 4-year-old's heart doing its work without being asked. Nyel sat like that for a long time. That was the whole world. Right there. In a supply alcove behind a fire door on the supply level of a building that had no idea either of them existed. Bleach smell. Elevator hum. Rain starting against the high windows somewhere above them. Small. And fragile. And entirely his. He didn't know yet that it was already half someone else's. And that 42 floors up, on a screen in a security office that never went dark, a report was loading with a timestamp of 2:47 a.m. And an access level that should have been impossible. And that somewhere in the building, a man who had never heard the name Nyel Corven was about to. 3 floors up, in the executive lobby, the scanner's access log had recorded one entry at 2:47 a.m. Badge number, unregistered. Access level, executive clearance. The system had flagged it automatically and sent the report to the 42nd floor, where Veyron Arkavale's security team worked through the night. Nyel paid for Sol's medication on a Tuesday. He paid rent on a Wednesday. He bought groceries Thursday morning before the late shift, walking 3 blocks past the closer store to the one where the manager let him use expired coupons if he came in before 8. This was not struggle. This was math. There was a difference. Struggle implied resistance. What Nyel did every week had no resistance in it. It was just sequencing. Move this. Wait for that. Stretch the $43 until it felt like 60. Hold everything together until the next paycheck arrived and the math started again.
The scent patch went on every morning before Sol woke up. Behind the left ear. Skin-colored. Expensive for what it was. A small chemical lie that told the world Nyel was something other than what he was. An omega. The kind of person the city wanted to classify and contain and route to the service corridors and the back elevators and the jobs that required them to be invisible and grateful for the invisibility. He'd been on the suppressants since he was 17. 14 years of medication whose only job was to make him easier to ignore. It worked. He was very easy to ignore. Sol woke up at 6:40, always without an alarm. This had been true since he was 18 months old, some internal clock that Nyel had never been able to locate or explain. He padded out of the bedroom in his socks, one hand trailing along the hallway, wall the way he always trailed his hand along walls, reading them the way other kids read picture books. He dragged the stuffed animal under his arm. The one with the missing button that had been lost somewhere around month 3 and never recovered. Not for lack of looking.
He climbed into the chair across from Nyel. He started eating cereal without being asked, reading the back of the box with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Ingredients, serving size, the small print about daily values. He did not understand most of it. He read it anyway. Nyel had learned not to rush this part of the morning. Soul's pace was soul's pace. You could not accelerate it and you could not slow it down. He moved through the world on his own internal schedule, and the world either adjusted or he ignored its impatience entirely. School today, Nyel said. Soul nodded. Already chewing. You gonna talk to the other kids today? Soul looked up. The question landed. He considered it with the full weight of his attention. Not dismissively, not quickly. The way he considered everything. Like it deserved a real answer. Maybe, he said. He went back to the box. Nyel watched him eat and thought, not for the first time, that Soul had arrived in the world already knowing things that most people spent decades trying to learn. The patience of him. The economy. The way he gave his attention completely to whatever was in front of him and withheld it completely from whatever wasn't. For years old. Already more composed than most of the adults Nyel had worked under. He thought about the program sometimes. Not often, he'd trained himself not to. It was a closed door in a room he'd sealed years ago and stopped walking past. He'd been 22, 3 weeks out of a shelter on East 118th, working 2-day jobs and barely holding a roof over a single-room sublet that technically wasn't legal for occupancy. The flyer had called it a fertility stabilization and wellness initiative. It had offered him 4 months of housing. Full medical coverage. No cost. He'd been cold and tired and running out of math. So he'd gone. The paperwork had been long. 41 pages, he'd counted later, a strange detail to remember, but some things land that way. He'd signed all of it. Every page that required a signature and several that only required an initial. He hadn't known what he was signing in the parts that mattered. They'd told him the donor records would be sealed. Permanently. That he would carry a child with no further contact or obligation from any contributing party. That the records would be destroyed after the program concluded. That he would walk away clean. Soul had arrived 9 months later. Perfect. Quiet. Already looking at everything like he was cataloging it. Nyel never asked questions about the donor. He told himself it was because the door was sealed. But the real reason was simpler than that. He didn't want to know. He didn't want there to be anyone else. Soul was his. Completely. The whole architecture of Nyel's daily life. The math and the sequences and the careful maneuvering. All of it existed to protect that one fact. He was washing the cereal bowl when Soul picked up his blue crayon and slid the paper across the table without a word. Nyel looked at it. A circle. A diagonal line through the center. Letters arranged around the outer edge, careful and uneven the way a 4-year-old's letters are, but deliberate, copied, not invented. What's this? Nyel said. I dreamed it, Soul said. Again. Nyel had seen this drawing 3 times in the last 2 weeks. The same circle every time. The same diagonal line. The same cluster of letters he hadn't recognized the first time he saw them. He recognized them now. He'd seen them on the shoulder patch of every security guard at Arkavale Tower. He put the drawing face down on the counter. He finished washing the bowl. His hands were steady. He made them be. Get your backpack, he said. Soul got his backpack. That evening, Nyel found the envelope slipped under his apartment door. No stamp. Hand-delivered. Plain white with the kind of weight that only comes from official paper. He opened it. Urgent request for after-hours service personnel. The Arkavale Gala. Saturday. Beginning at 10 p.m. Attendance mandatory for all contracted service staff. He had no choice. He knew that before he finished the first line. In the contract he'd signed for the service company, attendance refusals required 30 days' notice and a documented medical excuse. He had neither. He folded the letter, placed it on the counter on top of Soul's drawing. Stood in his kitchen for a very long time. The circle, the letters, the logo. Sol had never been inside Arkavale Tower. Sol had never seen a security guard up close. Sol had never set foot in any building that flew that crest. And yet there it was. On the paper. In blue crayon. Dreamed it, the boy had said. Again. The chandeliers alone cost more than Nyel made in 4 years. He knew this not because he'd looked it up but because the facilities manager, drunk by 11, leaning against a column in the back hall, had told him during setup. Like it was funny. Like the number was meant to land as a joke. Nyel had smiled. The right width. The right amount. He was good at the right amount. The gala was operational. Seamless. The kind of event that looked effortless because 43 people had been working since noon to make it look that way, and none of those 43 people would be remembered by any guest in attendance. Alpha pheromone hung in the air thick enough to feel on your skin. These weren't just wealthy people. These were dominant class wealthy people, the ones who moved through rooms and expected the air to rearrange itself ahead of them. Politicians. Logistics executives. At least 2 men Nyel recognized from federal regulatory news cycles, both smiling with their whole faces in a way that never reached their eyes. He had hidden Sol in the loading area backstage, past the service kitchen with its organized noise, steam trays clanking, someone calling out a count, the particular controlled chaos of catering staff running 100 things simultaneously without dropping any of them, past the linen storage, past the cold room where the catering team kept the desserts lined up under their covers like something waiting for a ceremony. Folding chair, a blanket, a juice box, the train book. He had crouched in front of Sol before leaving him there. Eye level. He had not said stay here. He had not said don't move or don't make noise or be good. Those words were not the right ones and he had learned that about Sol early. The boy responded to information, not instruction. So he had said, I'm working the East Hall. I'll pass here every 30 minutes. If you need me before that, you come to the East Hall door, the one with the blue handle, and you stand there and I will see you. Sol had looked at him, nodded once, went back to his book. Sol had not complained. Sol never complained. Nyel worked the East Hall. Trays in, trays out. He moved with the calibrated invisibility of someone who had spent years in rooms like this. The kind that required service staff to be present without being noticed, to function without existing in the consciousness of the people being served. He had an internal geometry for it. Angles, pacing, the specific body language of a person whose purpose is operational rather than social head level, no eye contact sustained long enough to become an invitation, movement that was purposeful enough to communicate legitimacy but not so direct that it drew attention. He was good at this. He had been doing it since he was 19. The crowd was its own kind of weather. Pheromone-thick, dominant class, the kind of room that had a specific atmospheric pressure you felt in your chest if you were an omega and your suppressant patch was doing its job. Tonight his patch was fresh. He had put on a new one before leaving the apartment. He could still feel the room pressing slightly, not overwhelming, just present. A reminder of what he was and what room he was in and what the distance between those two things required of him. He checked the alcove twice per hour. Both times Sol was seated, book open, lips moving slightly. The second time, Sol looked up and gave him a single nod, slow, even the way old men nod when an expected thing has proceeded as expected. For years old, nodding like a man confirming a schedule. Nyel almost smiled. He went back to work. At 11:22, the dessert service began. At 11:31, the program coordinator, a woman named Deja whose patience had been running at a deficit since the ice sculpture arrived cracked, waved Nyel into the service kitchen for a restocking run. Tray count. Inventory sheet. 6 minutes, maybe 8. He had been gone 4 minutes when he came back out. The first thing he registered was the room. Conversations had not stopped. They had shifted. Volume dropped by a precise half degree. The particular suspended quality of a room that has noticed something and not yet decided collectively what to call it. He looked toward the main floor. Sol was walking across it. Alone. Small white sneakers on black marble. Arms loose at his sides. Moving with that same unhurried certainty he moved with everywhere. Through grocery stores, through school hallways, through every space that did not belong to him and did not seem to know it yet. The boy was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at one person. The crowd parted without deciding to. It just happened. People shifted without understanding why they were shifting. Something about the child, that stillness, that particular atmosphere Soul carried in his body like a held note, made room without asking for it. Veyron Arkavale stood near the center of the floor. He was the kind of man who occupied centers of rooms because the geometry of rooms around him adjusted. Tall, black suit. The controlled, compressed expression of someone who had spent 30 years making sure his face was the last thing to tell the story. Soul walked directly to him. Stopped. Looked up. In a voice that was small and quiet and somehow reached every corner of that marble room at once. The boy said 2 syllables. Dada. The word landed. It didn't dissolve. It stayed in the air the way certain sounds stay in rooms that know how to hold them. Not one person in that room moved. Nyel's tray hit the floor. He didn't feel it leave his hands. He was already cutting through the crowd, 8 feet, 5'3", the single calculation running on every frequency in his body. Get Soul. Get Soul. Get Soul out of here before this becomes something permanent. He was 4 feet away when the security moved. 3 of them, from different directions. Earpieces. Controlled pace. Eyes tracking. Not Soul. Nyel. He stopped. He looked at Soul. Soul was still looking up at Veyron Arkavale. And Veyron Arkavale, who had sat across tables from senators, who had closed 9-figure deals without adjusting his expression, who had not publicly reacted to anything in a decade, slowly lowered himself to one knee on the marble floor. His eyes were not angry. They were the eyes of a man being handed something he had no room left to hold. Veyron said one word to his security team. Out. Not stand down. Not give us space. Just out. They moved. All 3 of them. Back through doors that closed without sound. The room had not recovered. It was still in that particular suspended state. Glasses paused mid-lift. Conversations halted at the exact syllable they'd been on when Soul had spoken. 300 people in evening were standing very still while a child stood in the center of the floor, and a man knelt on marble looking at him like the floor had just opened beneath him. One of the event coordinators materialized at Nyel's elbow. Sir, you need to. I know, Nyel said. He was already moving. He crossed the floor. 12 feet. 8, 4. He put his hand on Soul's shoulder and the boy leaned back into him without looking away from Veyron. I'm sorry, Nyel said. I'm sorry. He was in the back. I should have. What's his name? Veyron said. Not a question. The shape of a question without the softness of one. Soul. Veyron looked at the boy. Soul looked back. Something moved across Veyron's face that Nyel couldn't catalog. Not recognition. Not denial. Something before both of those, the raw, unprocessed thing that happened in the half-second before a person decided what to feel. How old? Veyron said. 4, Nyel said. He's 4. The math was instantaneous. Nyel saw it happen in Veyron's eyes, the calculation running, the timeline assembling itself, the implications arriving in sequence. 5 years ago. 4 years plus gestation. The math. Veyron stood. He was taller standing. The posture different. The controlled boardroom stillness back in place. Nyel recognized it. The thing powerful men did when something surprised them and they needed 6 seconds to reprocess it as a situation they were managing rather than one managing them. You work for contracted service, Veyron said. Yes. You brought a child to a private event. I had no other. I'm not accusing you. Veyron's voice was precise. I'm building a timeline. Nyel said nothing. Veyron looked at Soul again. Soul had not moved. Had not made a sound since those 2 syllables. He stood with that particular quality of his, that stillness, like he understood exactly what was happening and had decided to wait. We're going to a private room, Veyron said. You're going to bring your son, and I'm going to ask you some questions. I don't. It wasn't a request. There it was. Quiet. Not threatening. Just the flat factual statement of someone who did not live in a world where requests were the mechanism he used. Nyel looked at the crowd. which had very carefully redistributed its attention to other things. The pretending was its own kind of message. What happened here would be discussed. Tomorrow. Tonight even. These were people who traded in information the way others traded in stock. Soul. Nyel said it quietly. Soul took his hand. They followed Veyron through a side door into a hall that was carpeted and soundproofed and lit by recessed lighting that cost more per fixture than Nyel's rent. A glass wall on the left showed the skyline. 42 stories of it. Nyel kept his eyes ahead. Inside the private room, Veyron sat across a table that held a carafe of water and nothing else. He put his hands flat on the surface. Nyel sat. Soul climbed into the chair beside him without prompting and folded his hands on the table, which was a habit he'd developed from somewhere. Nyel had never taught him this, had never modeled it. It was just a thing Soul did when he found himself in formal situations and decided to be formal in response. The room was soundproofed. The gala was happening 300 feet away and the room knew nothing about it. 5 years ago, Veyron said, a stabilization program. Affiliated with Arkavale Wellness Partners. You participated. Nyel felt the cold move through him from the stomach up. He had spent 4 years not thinking about the program, not speaking about it, not letting the word stabilization sit in his brain long enough to follow the thread it was attached to. He had built a wall around it the same way he built walls around everything that had the potential to undo him. Brick by brick, every morning, maintained by the discipline of simply not going near it. And here it was, said out loud, in a room with brushed chrome fixtures and a carafe of water, by the man whose logo his son had drawn in blue crayon 14 times. You know about it, he said. I funded it, Veyron said. Not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. The specific flatness of a man who had been delivering bad news to himself in private for some amount of time and had already processed the shock of it. As a charitable initiative, I was told by 3 separate people in 3 separate meetings that the program's records had been destroyed, that all participants had been anonymized, that no biological linkage would ever be traceable. He looked at Soul, and something crossed his face that Nyel could not name. The closest word was grief, but grief for what had not yet been confirmed. Pre-grief, the ache of a thing that hadn't finished arriving yet. I did not consent to parenthood, Veyron said. That's not an accusation directed at you. I'm telling you what I was told. And what I was told appears to have been a lie. The room held that. Nyel looked at the carafe of water. He thought about the flyer, the 41 pages, the cold feet. He thought about the version of himself at 22 who had walked into a program office on East 118th and signed everything placed in front of him because the alternative was going back to a shelter with an empty stomach. He had not known what he was signing. He needed Veyron to understand that. I didn't know what I was agreeing to, Nyel said. Not fully. I knew there was a donor. I knew the records would be sealed. I didn't know. I know, Veyron said. He said it quietly, not cutting Nyel off, just receiving it, acknowledging it, moving it from the space of accusation to the space of shared information. If this is what it appears to be, Veyron said, then someone committed fraud against both of us. Soul, beside Nyel, reached over and placed one small hand on the table. Not toward either of them, just on the table, present. Veyron looked at it. The expression came back. The unprocessed one. The one before the controlled version. Then, slowly, he signed the private DNA authorization form that his assistant had placed at the edge of the table while they were talking. Nyel hadn't seen it arrive. He capped the pen, set it down precisely parallel to the paper's edge. We'll know in 72 hours, he said. He didn't say what happened after that. He didn't need to. The results weren't what Nyel was afraid of. It was what came after the results. That was the thing that was going to cost him everything he hadn't yet understood he had. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. This was the first thing Nyel noticed when the security team walked him through it. Not the view, 4 floors up, not high but facing a park, real trees, the kind of detail Manhattan charged for. Not the kitchen with its full-sized refrigerator and the herb garden already set in the window. Not the fact that the heating system worked immediately and continuously without being negotiated with. 2 bedrooms. He stood in the doorway of the smaller one and looked at it for a long time. Sol ran past him, assessed the room in 12 seconds, and announced that the window was the right size. Nyel didn't ask for what. There was a grocery delivery the next morning. Someone had asked about dietary restrictions, and Nyel had answered the form honestly, and now there were things in the refrigerator that he had not purchased. The medication Sol needed was in a paper bag on the counter, 3 months' supply, with a receipt that showed 0. Nyel sat at the kitchen table and looked at the 0 for a long time. A security escort showed up for Sol's school run on Wednesday. 2 people. Quiet. 1 in front, 1 behind, the distance calibrated to be present without being obvious. Sol greeted them like he'd been expecting them. Nyel watched from the building entrance. He didn't know what to do with any of this. He'd spent 14 years building a system. The system was held together by compression, by the discipline of not wanting more than what existed, by the precision of making $43 feel like 60. That system had kept them safe. It had kept them fed. It had kept Sol in medication and kept Nyel's scent patches current and kept both of them invisible in all the ways that mattered. Now the compression was gone, and he didn't know what to do with the space it left. Veyron came by on Thursday evening. Nyel hadn't expected it. He'd expected a lawyer or a coordinator, one of the people who managed things for people like Veyron. He hadn't expected the man himself, standing in the doorway in a jacket without a tie, looking slightly uncertain, which was the first time Nyel had seen him look like anything other than someone processing a situation. The heater in the living room had been making a sound, a rattling that happened every 40 minutes on a cycle that Nyel had already documented in his head, the timing and the pitch and the pauses. Veyron crouched beside it, opened the side panel, looked at it for 30 seconds, then adjusted something inside with his fingers and stood up. The rattling did not come back. "I know what that is," Veyron said. "Not boastful, just factual. Old building I owned in Baltimore. Same unit." Nyel said nothing. They ate dinner. It was not planned. Sol had looked at Veyron across the living room and said pasta the way a 4-year-old announces a need. Not asking, just stating the way you state a fact that requires no discussion. And Nyel had cooked it because that was what he did, and the portions had ended up being more than 2 people required, and Veyron had sat at the table like someone who understood he had been placed in a situation and was choosing carefully to be inside it without making it formal. They did not talk about the program. They did not talk about the DNA test or the envelope or the 72 hours or any of the things that existed in the room the way weather exists. You can feel it without naming it. Instead they talked about Soul School and the park across the street, and a documentary Sol had apparently watched twice about deep-sea fish that had small bioluminescent lights on the ends of stalks attached to their heads. "The light is for hunting," Sol explained. "But it's also lonely." Veyron looked at him. "How do you know it's lonely?" he said. Sol considered this seriously. "Because it's the only light down there," Sol said. Nyel watched Veyron receive this. Watched him not say anything for a moment. Watched him look at this 4-year-old who had just articulated something about isolation that most adults spent decades not being able to put into words. Sol demonstrated the light anyway. Put one hand above his forehead and wiggled his fingers, slow and deliberate. Then went back to his pasta. Veyron watched him eat. The expression on his face was the one from the gala floor. Not the boardroom version. The one underneath. Raw. Unprocessed. The specific unguarded look of a person who has just realized, in real time, what they were deprived of without knowing they were being deprived of it. Nyel saw it. He filed it. He did not react to it because it was not the right time to react to it and because he had not yet decided what to do with the things he was noticing about Veyron Arkavale, who had crouched beside a rattling heater, who had fixed it, who had sat at a kitchen table talking about bioluminescent fish without once reaching for his phone. After Sol went to bed, Veyron sat across from Nyel at the kitchen table and looked at the countertop for a long moment. Not speaking, just there. The particular quality of someone who had something to say and was choosing the right version of it. "The results are ready," Veyron said. The envelope was in his jacket pocket. He did not reach for it. I want you to know, Veyron said, that whatever they say, your situation doesn't change. The apartment, the coverage, that's done regardless. Why? Nyel said. Veyron looked up. Because you've been managing alone for 4 years, Veyron said. With no support and no information, and that was wrong. Whether I'm in the picture or not. Nyel studied him for a moment. He wanted to trust that. He could feel how much he wanted to trust it. That was the dangerous part. The wanting. He had survived this long by not wanting things that could be taken back. Veyron set the envelope on the table between them. Neither of them opened it. The next morning, Nyel found it still there. He'd made coffee. He'd packed Sol's bag. He'd stood at the window and watched the park for a while. He came back to the table and the envelope was still sitting there. Sealed, patient, holding whatever it held. And he thought about how strange it was that a number on paper could change the shape of everything you had built around the absence of that number. He thought about Sol demonstrating the deep-sea light at the dinner table. The only light down there. He reached for the envelope. His phone buzzed first. He looked at it reflexively. Old habit. The trained response of someone whose phone only buzzed with things that required attention. Medication reminders, schedule notifications, the occasional work text that could not wait. A news alert. He looked at the headline. Then looked again because sometimes the brain rejects information the first time through. It was already moving across 2 networks. Not a rumor. Not a gossip account. 2 legitimate news networks with verified headers and live tickers. Billionaire Veyron Arkavale, secret Omega heir. Named. His name. Sol's name. His address. The old one, the building he'd worked at, but still enough. The envelope was no longer the question. The world had answered it without waiting. And whatever safety Nyel had built, in the compressed life, in the careful math, in the right distances, in the deliberate art of going unnoticed, was already completely gone. It had been gone since the moment Sol walked across a marble floor and said one word. Nyel had just not understood yet what gone meant. The number came back 99%. Not a possibility. Not a likelihood. 99. Veyron's attorney read it aloud at 8:47 in the morning in the private meeting room on the 42nd floor, and the word hung in the recycled air like smoke. Nyel sat across the long table with Sol beside him, the boy drawing in the margins of a blank legal pad someone had left on the table, not listening or at least appearing not to listen, that quiet attention of his always running somewhere underneath the surface. 99% paternal match. The attorney, a woman named Cassandra Briggs, silver-haired, the kind of composed that comes from 40 years of delivering information that changes rooms, set the document down flat and folded her hands. She did not say congratulations. That was the tell. Congratulations was the word for situations where the outcome was simply good. Cassandra Briggs had been in enough rooms to know when a number that sounded like good news was actually the first domino in a longer sequence. Veyron sat at the head of the table looking at the document. He did not look shaken. He looked like a man applying tremendous internal pressure to the act of remaining still. What are the next steps? He said. Acknowledgement filing, Cassandra said. If you choose public acknowledgement, we prepare a statement. If you choose private paternity establishment, we file quietly and build from there. And if I choose nothing, the DNA result still exists, she said. And the leak from last night made that decision for you partially. Veyron looked across the table at Nyel. Nyel looked back. He was not going to look away first. He had spent his whole life looking away first, from residents who accused him, from managers who condescended, from every room that expected him to not quite occupy it. He was done with that particular habit. What do you want? Veyron said. The question was direct. No softness around it, no diplomatic framing. Just that, what do you want? Addressed to Nyel the way people address things to each other when they had decided to stop pretending the power differential in the room was invisible. Nyel looked at Sol, who was drawing a fish in the margin of the legal pad. Large eyes. No scales. Very careful fins. I want him to be okay, Nyel said. That's the whole list. The room held that. Cassandra made a note. 3 hours later, Veyron Arkavale stood in front of a bank of cameras outside Arkavale Tower and confirmed to 7 reporters, for news networks, and a live feed that had already reached 400,000 viewers that he was the biological father of a 4-year-old boy named Sol. He said it without flinching. He said the boy's name clearly, with the weight of someone who understood that a name said publicly was a name that now existed in a different way. Nyel watched it on a tablet in the private room upstairs. Sol was asleep on the couch, one arm thrown over his face, the fish drawing visible on the legal pad beside him. The comments on the live feed were already moving faster than reading aloud. Words like beautiful, words like finally, words like this changes everything. The public sympathy was immediate and enormous. Nyel had expected scrutiny, the kind reserved for Omega men who turned up in the lives of billionaires, the suspicion that traveled in the same cultural lane as gold digger and opportunist. What he got instead was something he had no category for. People were moved. Mothers in their kitchens watching on their phones. Fathers on lunch breaks reading headlines. Omega advocacy groups who had been following the fertility program story for 2 years without enough evidence to push it into the mainstream, suddenly with a human face attached to it. Sol's face, which Nyel had not consented to. But there it was. Cassandra came into the room 40 minutes later and set her tablet beside Nyel's without saying anything first. That was another thing about Cassandra Briggs. She had spent enough years in rooms where information changed lives that she had learned to let numbers breathe before she added words to them. The fertility program story is connecting, she said. The public narrative is sympathetic. People are angry, not at you, at the program, at the contract structures. They don't know what those structures were yet, Nyel said. They know enough, Cassandra said. And right now, anger is its own kind of momentum. The feed kept moving. Nyel watched names appear in the comments faster than he could read them. Omega advocacy accounts sharing the story. Journalists who had been circling the fertility program for 18 months without enough sourcing suddenly tagging each other in public. A senator from New York had already released a brief statement noting that her office was aware of the Arkavale announcement and would be seeking information about the program's charter status. A senator. Nyel had never been the kind of person senators were aware of. He set the tablet down. Sol stirred on the couch, turned onto his side. One hand pressed flat against the cushion. Didn't wake. Nyel watched his son sleep and tried to locate the feeling he had expected to arrive at some point in this process. He had assumed it would feel like relief, like the specific exhale of a person who has been carrying weight so long that setting it down registers as its own physical sensation. It was there. Partially. He could feel something in the direction of it. But underneath, like a floor that might not hold a person standing on it, something else moved. Something that did not have a comfortable name. Exposure was not protection. He had understood this abstractly for years, the way visible targets draw attention, the way seen and safe were not the same resource. But understanding something in the abstract was one thing. Sitting in a private room on the 42nd floor with his son's name in 400,000 news feeds was another thing entirely. The world knowing Sol existed did not make Sol safer. It made Sol known. And known, in this particular story, inside the specific machinery of what the fertility program had actually been, was not a simple thing. He had lived invisible for 14 years, and that invisibility had been a kind of armor. Now the armor was gone. Every camera pointed at the Arkavale Tower press conference had also indirectly pointed at them. The Sol. He didn't know yet what that meant. He found out at 11:58 that night. Veyron's head of security, a man named Dexton Cross, built like someone who'd been made for exactly this function, calm in the specific way of people whose calm is a professional discipline, appeared in the doorway of the private room and said 4 words. "We need to move." Nyel was on his feet before the sentence finished. Sol was already awake, eyes open, watching. "What happened?" Nyel said. Dexton looked at him. "Arkavale stock dropped 14% at close," he said. "And 20 minutes ago, someone accessed the building's residential security system from an external IP." Nyel went cold. "The breach was contained," Dexton said. "Nothing physical. But whoever did it was looking at room access logs. Specifically, the floors assigned to you and Sol. Nyel looked at Sol. Sol was watching the exchange with those green eyes that never missed anything and never showed panic. That, more than anything, was what broke Nyel open that night. The boy was 4 years old and he had never once learned to panic. Because panic had never been a useful option. Because their life, their small, compressed, careful life, had trained him out of it before he was old enough to know what panic was. Nyel picked up Sol's shoes from beside the couch, knelt down, started putting them on. "Tell me where," he said to Dexton. And Dexton told him. And the feeling that had felt like safety 2 hours ago. The recognition, the public warmth, the 99% revealed itself for what it actually was. A door that had opened, and left them standing in it. The kidnapping attempt happened at 6:14 in the morning. Not inside the building. On the service road that ran along the building's east side, the one Nyel had used every Tuesday night for 2 years, the one that connected to the loading area where the sanitation vehicles came through. Someone had known about that road. Someone had known the schedule. 2 vehicles. Black. No plates visible on the camera footage that Dexton showed Nyel 40 minutes later in a secure room 3 floors below the main residence. The footage was sharp and clear and showed 2 men stepping out of the second vehicle at exactly the moment that Sol's school escort, the quiet pair who had been doing the morning run without incident for 2 weeks, was loading into the first. Sol was not with them. Nyel had kept Sol back that morning. The feeling. Nothing concrete. Just the specific weight of an instinct he'd learned to respect over 14 years of making small decisions that kept them both above water. He'd kept Sol back. The escort had driven a decoy route. The 2 men in the footage had waited at the service road for 11 minutes. Then driven away. Nyel watched the footage twice. Then sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing for a long time. Dexton let him. This was what Nyel was learning about Dexton Cross. The man had a rare professional quality. He understood when silence was working and didn't interrupt it. "They knew the escort," Nyel said finally. "The vehicle. The route." "Yes," Dexton said. "That's inside information." "Yes." Nyel looked at him. "From inside this building," Nyel said. Dexton met his eyes. "That's what we're currently determining." Veyron came in 20 minutes later. He'd been in a call with Cassandra and 2 federal regulatory contacts. His jacket was off. He looked like he'd been awake since before Nyel was, which meant he'd probably been awake all night. He sat down across from Nyel without preamble. "Tell me what you know," Nyel said. Veyron didn't hesitate. "Arkavale Wellness Partners ran the fertility program," he said. "I funded it. I was told it was a humanitarian initiative. Stabilization services for Omega individuals in economically precarious situations. Housing, medical, nutrition. The fertility component was disclosed as optional. Participating donors were told their contributions were anonymous and records would be destroyed." "They weren't destroyed," Nyel said. "No. So there are records. Of every donor. Every participant." "Yes." Nyel let that sit for 2 seconds. "Sol wasn't a coincidence," he said. "They chose his donor deliberately." Veyron's jaw moved. "That's what our investigation is indicating," he said. "The program appears to have been used to create genetic succession insurance. Omega participants carry children for elite alpha donors who wanted biological heirs without the public or legal exposure of acknowledged parenthood." The words were clean and precise and utterly devastating. Nyel heard them land one at a time. Succession insurance. He stayed very still. He had learned, over 14 years, that stillness was the correct response to the largest categories of information. Movement was for the manageable things. For the things this size you just had to sit inside them and let them finish arriving. Sol. His son, who read train books and drew eyeless fish and nodded like an old man and had never once complained about a folded blanket in a supply closet, had been designed as a contingency, a biological asset, a backup heir created for a man who hadn't known he existed, gestated by a man who hadn't known what he was signing, kept in institutional records for exactly the moment when the asset's activation would serve the program's purpose best. That was the architecture. All of it. clean and intentional and designed around people who were poor enough to need 4 months of housing more than they needed to understand 41 pages of legal language. The room was very quiet. Dexton was watching Nyel with that professional calm. Veyron's hands were flat on the table. Cassandra was writing something. Not speaking, just writing. How many? Nyel said. Veyron looked at him. Children, Nyel said. How many children were created through this program? The pause before Veyron answered was exactly 1 second too long. We've identified at least 11 confirmed cases, Veyron said. There may be more records we haven't accessed yet. 11 children. 11 families. 11 Nyel somewhere in this city, in rooms that were too small, running their careful math, not knowing. They're going to try again, Nyel said. We believe so, Dexton said from the doorway. Nyel stood up. He walked to the window. 42 floors of Manhattan below him, the city moving the way it always moved. Indifferent, enormous, conducting its business without reference to anyone inside any particular building. He had lived inside this city's indifference his whole life. He understood it. He had made a home inside it. Now the indifference had a specific face, a legal structure, a program with executive signatures and shareholder protections and federal charity status. He turned back from the window. Where's Sol? He said. Conference room B, Dexton said. Coloring. 2 guards on the door. Nyel nodded. He started toward the door. Nyel. Veyron's voice stopped him. Not the tone of authority. Something different. Something that didn't have a name yet in the vocabulary of what these 2 men were to each other, which was still being determined in real time without a template for guidance. Nyel turned. Acknowledging him publicly, Veyron said. I need you to know I understood what that would do. To me. To the Empire. To every arrangement I have that depends on controlled information. He stopped, then said the rest of it. I knew it would do this. I did it anyway. Nyel looked at him. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He filed it in the part of himself that was still deciding what Veyron Arkavale was and what that was going to mean, and walked out of the room. Down the hall, behind the door marked conference room B, Sol was coloring. A train. Red engine. Yellow wheels. He looked up when Nyel came in. That same green-eyed assessment. Reading the room. Reading Nyel's face. Are we okay? Sol said. 4 years old. 4 years old and asking the adult question. The real one. Not are we safe, but are we okay? The distinction a child makes when they have been paying attention long enough to understand that those 2 things are not always the same. Nyel sat down beside him. We're going to be, he said. Sol went back to his train. And the security breach report that Dexton pulled 1 hour later showed something that changed the entire shape of everything they thought they understood. Nyel read it twice. Then read it a 3rd time because the first 2 times he had read it too fast, looking for the part where it said what he'd expected it to say. A rival business, a competitor, someone with a grudge against Veyron's financial empire, something that made sense inside the story he had been living for the last 2 weeks. The 3rd time he read it slowly. The internal access. The leaked escort route. The compromised security information. None of it had come from Veyron's team. It had come from the legal office of Arkavale Wellness Partners. The fertility program. Nyel set the report down on the table. He thought about the envelope. The invitation that had arrived under his apartment door. Mandatory attendance for contracted service staff. He had assumed it was routine. He had assumed his name had come up in a staffing database and someone had pulled his contract and sent the letter. He understood now that his name had not come up randomly. He had been placed at the gala deliberately. They had known who he was. They had known about Sol. They had been watching the program's assets. Their word, not his, for years. And when Veyron Arkavale's biometric systems had flagged a child with executive clearance in the lobby at 2:47 in the morning, someone in a legal office had begun moving their timeline forward. They were not trying to take Sol because Veyron had acknowledged him publicly. They had been building toward this for months. The acknowledgement had only forced them to move faster than they had planned. Dexton was watching Nyel read this understanding settle across his face. We're ahead of them, Dexton said. For now. For now. That was the part that mattered. The legal order arrived on a Thursday. Courier delivered. Hand-signed. Federal letterhead. Cassandra Briggs read it in 4 minutes and called Veyron before she'd finished the last page. Nyel was in the room when the call came. He watched Veyron's face move through several expressions it didn't usually allow and arrive at something flat and controlled that Nyel was learning to recognize as the face Veyron used when he was most furious. The order cited Arkavale Wellness Partners' original program charter. Under a clause buried in Section 14C of the Charitable Foundation's operational agreement, children born through the program's fertility services were classified as, and the legal language here was so clean it could cut, program assets whose custodial arrangement was subject to review by the program's oversight board in the event of a public dispute regarding biological origin. Assets, not children. Assets. Nyel heard the word through Cassandra's summary, and something inside him went very quiet. Not cold. Not panicked. Something older than both of those. The deep stillness of a person who has just understood exactly what they are dealing with and is choosing, in real time, what to do about it. They can't enforce this, Veyron said. In federal civil court, with their current legal team and the original program charter's immunity clauses, they can delay custody for 18 to 36 months while the case is adjudicated, Cassandra said. They don't need to win. They need the timeline. Nyel looked at her. Why the timeline? She set down the document. Because in 18 months Sol turns 6. And at 6, under the program charter's secondary clause, his status as a program asset converts to voluntary heir designation, which means they can present him to the original contracting alpha, which would be Veyron, as a formal succession instrument. A legal biological heir, with all rights attached. I already acknowledged him, Veyron said. Outside of the program's legal structure, Cassandra said. Your public acknowledgement occurred before the paternity filing was processed through the correct channels. They're arguing the acknowledgement is invalid under the program's original covenant. The room went silent. Nyel understood all of it. All of it. This was not a custody dispute. This was a property claim. The program had not created Sol as a person. They had created him as a document. A living, breathing legal instrument designed to activate at the right moment, to pass between the right hands, to serve the right institutional purposes. And for 4 years of cereal at 6:40 and train books and juice boxes in supply closets. No one had told Nyel that. He stood up. I need an hour, he said. Cassandra started to say something about the filing deadline. An hour, Nyel said again. Quiet, clear, not a request. He walked out. He walked down the hall. Past the conference room. Past the security station. Past the elevator bank. He took the stairs, 2 flights down, the way he always took stairs in buildings when he needed to think, the movement of it, the rhythm, the physical fact of 1 step at a time when everything else was moving too fast to follow. He sat on a step on the 40th floor landing, put his head in his hands, and let himself feel it. All of it. The full weight of every decision he hadn't known he was making. Signing those 41 pages in a program office on East 118th with cold feet and an empty stomach and the desperate arithmetic of a person who needed 4 months of housing more than they needed to read every clause. He had been 22 years old. He had been 3 weeks out of a shelter and 2 jobs that paid cash and a sublet that technically wasn't legal. He had been running the math for 6 months and the math had not been working, and then a flyer had appeared. Stabilization. Wellness. No cost. He had gone. He had signed. He had not been foolish. He had been poor. There was a difference. Profound one. Foolish implied a choice made badly. What Nyel had done was not a bad choice. It was the only choice available in that specific moment to that specific person. The program had been designed to reach people in exactly that moment. When the options were narrow enough and the need was large enough that 41 pages with charitable language looked like rescue rather than contract. That was not a coincidence. They had built the program around that design on purpose. Not in spite of the vulnerability. Because of it. Because vulnerable people sign things. Because desperate people did not have lawyers on retainer. Because the guarantee of housing was worth more than the risk of pages you didn't fully understand. That was the architecture underneath the architecture. And somewhere in this city there were 10 other people who had sat in similar offices with cold feet and empty stomachs and signed the same pages. 10 other people who had walked away with housing and returned 9 months later with a child and a sealed record and a promise that everything was simple and clean and permanent. 10 other people who did not know yet that their child had been classified as an asset. He stayed on the stair landing for 23 minutes. He did not move until he had finished feeling all of it. Then he stood up, because that was what you did. You felt the full weight of it. And then you stood up, because there was still a child at a table with a crayon, and that child needed what came next to be better than what came before. He went back up the stairs. He went back up the stairs. Back down the hall. Into the room where Cassandra and Veyron were still sitting, the documents still on the table between them. "What can you prove?" he said to Veyron. "About the program's fraud." Veyron looked at him. "We have internal communications showing the program's executives knew the Omega consent forms were structured to obscure the asset classification clause," Veyron said. "We have email chains discussing the genetic selection process, which donors were matched to which participants and why. We have 3 employees of the program who have indicated willingness to provide testimony." "Have you used any of it?" Nyel said. "No," Veyron said. "Our legal strategy was to fight the custody order first." "Use it now," Nyel said. "All of it. Public. Today." Cassandra straightened. "If we go public with the fraud evidence before the custody hearing, the program can't fight a custody order and a federal fraud exposure at the same time," Nyel said. "Their legal team divides. Their board panics. Their funders pull out." He looked at Veyron. "You told me someone committed fraud against both of us," he said. "You said that the night we sat in that room with the DNA paper on the table. You meant it." "Yes," Veyron said. "Then prove it," Nyel said. "Not in a courtroom in 18 months. Now, while Soul is still 4 years old and the story is still the story." Cassandra was already on her phone. Veyron looked at Nyel across the table. That same expression, the one from the gala floor. The one before the controlled version arrived. Raw. Unprocessed. Then he nodded once and reached for his own phone. What happened over the next 9 hours was not clean, and it was not comfortable, and it did not feel like winning. It felt like opening something that had been sealed for a long time and dealing with whatever came out. Internal documents pushed to 3 investigative journalists who had been building the fertility program story for 2 years without enough sourcing to publish. 3 former program employees making statements. Cassandra filing an emergency injunction against the custody order, while simultaneously submitting the fraud evidence to the Federal Oversight Board that had granted the program its charity status. By 11 p.m., the story had moved from the Arkavale Gala gossip cycle to the national news cycle. Fertility program used Omega participants as genetic breeding contracts for elite alphas. 11 children, named. Nyel sat in conference room B watching it move across screens. Soul was asleep in the chair beside him, head tipped sideways, one hand under his cheek, the train book on the floor. Nyel watched his son sleep. He watched the story spread, and he thought about the 41 pages, and the cold feet, and the empty stomach, and the 4 months of housing that had cost him 4 years of not knowing. He thought about the other 10 families, somewhere in this city, in rooms like his used to be, running their math, not knowing. That was the thing that sat heaviest. Not what had happened to Soul, not the legal threat, not the custody order with its cold bureaucratic language. The 10 others. He picked up his phone. He called Cassandra. "The other children," he said when she answered. "The 11 cases. Are they being contacted?" Pause on the line. That's a separate legal process." "Start it," he said. Another pause. "Mr. Corven." "Cassandra," he said. "Start it." She started it. Soul shifted in the chair. Settled. The news cycle kept moving. And somewhere in the building, Veyron Arkavale was dismantling a partnership worth $300 million because it was connected to the program's funding structure. And he was doing it without hesitation, and Nyel was learning, slowly, carefully, the way he learned everything, what it meant when someone chose accountability over armor. He had not decided yet what to do with that information, but he was keeping it. He left on a Tuesday, the same day of the week he had always paid for Sol's medication. The same day he had always started his weekly math. The rhythm of it was not lost on him. Tuesday was his day for necessary things. He packed one bag, Sol's backpack plus a rolling carry-on that had belonged to a resident at a building Nyel had cleaned 3 years back, left by the service entrance with a note that said take it. The zipper is fine. He had kept it under his bed ever since, not because he'd planned to run but because people who had learned to survive understood that you kept the things that helped you move. Sol watched him pack from the doorway of the bedroom. He didn't ask questions. This was the thing about Sol that Nyel could not fully hold without something in his chest going tight. The boy had always, somehow, understood more than he was supposed to. He watched Nyel fold the 2 extra sets of clothes and the medication and the documents folder and the train book that went everywhere, and he did not ask where they were going. He went and got his own shoes, put them on, sat on the edge of his bed and waited. Nyel stood in the hallway outside Sol's door for a moment. He looked at the apartment. 2 bedrooms, view of the park, herb garden in the window, the heater that no longer rattled. He thought about what it had taken to get here. The gala, the DNA envelope, the number 99. He thought about the custody order, the asset clause, Section 14C. He thought about the security breach and the 2 black vehicles and the 11 other children. He left a note on the kitchen table. 3 sentences. He crossed out the first draft twice before he got it right. Said, "This is not because of you. It is because of them. Keep Sol safe means me going somewhere they can't make her a target for reaching him." He used the wrong pronoun in the 3rd sentence because his hands were not entirely steady. He did not go back and fix it. He closed the door. He took Sol's hand. He took the stairs. On the way down he thought about what it meant to choose disappearance when you had finally, for the first time in your adult life, been seen. Truly seen. Not by the public. The public's attention was a different thing entirely, warm and unreliable and built on a story rather than a person. But by someone specific. Someone who had knelt on a marble floor and looked at a small boy and not calculated how to use him. That was the thing Nyel was choosing to walk away from. He knew it. He was walking away from it anyway. Because love, real love, the kind that isn't about what you get, sometimes looks like removing yourself from the equation before your presence makes the equation dangerous. Sol was 4 years old. Sol did not need to be at the center of a legal war for the next 18 months while institutions with federal immunity and 300-person legal teams decided what kind of person he was allowed to be. Sol needed the train book, and the fish drawings, and cereal at 6:40, and someone to put his shoes on. They rode the bus north, then a train, then a second bus. The city changed slowly. First it was just the skyline thinning, the gap between buildings widening, the glass towers giving way to brick giving way to low structures and parking lots and the particular unadorned landscape of the outer boroughs. Then that gave way to highway. Then the highway gave way to something quieter. The signs changed. The distances between exits grew longer. The names became unfamiliar. Sol slept through all of it. He had climbed into the seat, pressed his face against Nyel's arm, and been asleep in under 4 minutes. The way he had always slept, completely without visible struggle, like a person who had made peace with the fact that being unconscious was a reasonable option and there was no point fighting it. Nyel kept his arm still. He looked out the window. Trees. Just trees. He had not made phone calls. He had not told anyone the route. He had a number saved in his phone. A contact to Sandra had pressed into his hand 2 days before the custody order arrived. A safe relocation resource connected to the Omega Legal Advocacy Network that had been building a parallel case against the fertility program for 18 months. He had called that number from a payphone at the bus station, which felt like a decision from a different era, but payphones still existed in 3 locations within walking distance of Arkavale Tower, and Nyel had known where all 3 were for 2 years. They had given him an address. A small apartment outside the city. 2 months covered, no strings, renewable if the legal situation required it. Math again. 2 months to figure out what came next. The second bus stopped at 9:42 p.m. In a town with one diner and a gas station and a post office closed for the night. A woman from the advocacy network was waiting in the parking lot. She did not ask questions. She drove them to the apartment, showed Nyel where the keys were, left a bag of groceries on the counter, and said she would check in by phone in 3 days. Then she left. Nyel stood in the kitchen of the small apartment with Sol still half asleep against his shoulder and looked at the bag of groceries. He put Sol to bed. He unpacked the groceries. He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a place that had no history with him and let himself be still for the first time in 3 weeks. Just trees outside the window. Just quiet. Just the particular relief of being somewhere that no one with institutional authority and a legal charter had any particular reason to look. He had not made phone calls. He had not announced this. He had a number saved in his phone. A contact to Sandra had given him 3 days ago, a safe relocation resource attached to the Omega Legal Advocacy Network that had been circling this case since the public story broke. He had called that number from a payphone at the bus station. They had given him an address. A small apartment. 2 months covered. Math again. 2 months to figure out what came next. What came next? That was the question he sat with while Sol slept and the trees kept moving outside the window and the city got further away 1 mile at a time. What came next for the 11 children? What came next for the program's executives, who were currently under federal investigation? What came next for Veyron Arkavale, who had spent the last 48 hours publicly dismantling every financial partnership connected to the program's funding structure at an estimated loss of $300 million. $300 million. Nyel thought about his $43. He almost laughed. He didn't. Sol was asleep. He looked at his son's face. That's the whole world, he thought. Right there. He had thought it before. In a supply closet on a cold floor with his hand over Sol's heartbeat. The same thought, the same truth, small, and entirely his. 6 months passed. The federal investigation produced indictments for 4 executives of Arkavale Wellness Partners Program Division. The charity status was revoked. The Asset Classification Clause, Section 14C and its subclauses, was struck by a federal judge in a ruling that took 17 minutes to read aloud and produced, when excerpted and distributed, a moment of very public reckoning with the legal infrastructure that had made the program possible in the first place. The 11 families were contacted. 9 of them chose to engage with the advocacy network. 2 could not be reached. The custody order against Sol was vacated. Veyron released a public statement that said, in part, that he had dissolved the partnerships in question because the correct response to being complicit in a system, even unknowingly, was accountability, not legal maneuvering. The statement was 4 paragraphs. The 4th paragraph said, "My son is 4 years old. He reads train books. He draws fish without scales. He is not a succession instrument. He is a person. I owe him and the people who raised him every ounce of effort it takes to make that true in law and not just in feeling." Nyel read the 4th paragraph on his phone in the small apartment with the trees outside the window. He read it twice. Sol was at the kitchen table drawing. A new fish. This one had scales. Small, careful, overlapping ovals that the boy had apparently decided to add after 6 months of thinking about it. Progress, Nyel thought. He put his phone down. He looked at his son. He thought about the note he had left on the table in the Manhattan apartment. The wrong pronoun. The crossed-out lines. The 3 sentences that had not said what he actually meant but had said the only version of it he'd been able to get down on paper at 4 in the morning with unsteady hands. He thought about a man kneeling on a marble floor. Not angry. Terrified. He thought about fixed heaters and shared dinners about deep-sea fish with lights on their heads. He sat at the table beside Sol. He picked up a crayon, blue, the same one Sol always chose first, and drew a train in the corner of Sol's paper. Rough, not detailed, just the shape of it. Sol looked at it, approved, and went back to his fish. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, there was a knock at the door. The rain started before the knock. Not heavy. The light kind, the kind that taps rather than pounds, that makes the windows go soft around the edges and turns the trees outside into something that looks like a painting someone started and then decided was finished. Nyel was making tea. Sol was at the table with the fish drawing, which now had scales on every fish, a consistent detail he had apparently committed to as a permanent part of his artistic practice. The knock came 3 times. Even. Not rushed. Not hesitant. The kind of knock from someone who has driven a long way and is choosing, at the end of it, not to arrive in a hurry. Nyel turned the stove down. He didn't move toward the door immediately. He stood in the kitchen and breathed for a moment, the way you breathe before something you've been thinking about for 6 months finally stops being a thought and becomes a fact. Then he moved. He looked through the small window beside the door. Veyron Arkavale stood on the step in the rain. No guards. No security detail. No car running at the curb with an engine idling. Just him. One man in a jacket that had rain on the shoulders and the look of something worn rather than chosen. Hair wet at the edges where he hadn't thought to cover it. Looking at the door with an expression that had nothing controlled about it at all. He looked tired. Not defeated. That was important. Not the tired of someone who had lost. The tired of someone who had spent 6 months making hard right choices. The kind that cost you sleep and cost you money and cost you the particular comfort of being able to tell yourself you didn't know, that you couldn't have known, that no one could have expected you to do better than you did, and had arrived at the end of all that at a door in the rain. Without armor. Just the man. Nyel had spent 6 months building a picture of what this moment would look like if it came. He had assumed there would be lawyers. A formal arrangement. Custody coordination. Scheduled time, structured and legal and organized around the welfare of the child in a way that kept everything contained. He had not expected rain. He had not expected one person standing in it. Nyel opened the door. They looked at each other. 6 months of distance in the space between them. 6 months of legal battles and public statements and federal investigations and $300 million dismantled piece by piece. 6 months of a child drawing fish at a kitchen table in a town with 1 diner. 6 months of Nyel sitting with a blue crayon and adding trains to the corners of Sol's papers and thinking about what it meant when someone chose accountability over armor. All of that in the space of a doorway. In the rain. Veyron did not speak first. He didn't move. He stood in the rain and waited, and Nyel understood this as a deliberate choice, not a social instinct. The man who had spent his entire professional life occupying rooms and controlling their geometry was standing in the rain outside a door, not asking for anything, waiting for the door's owner to decide. Nyel stepped back. That was the invitation. Veyron came inside. He stood in the small living room and looked at it. The single couch, the table with Sol's drawings layered on top of each other, the window with the trees going soft in the rain, the train book on the arm of the chair. He took in all of it with a thorough, quiet attention that reminded Nyel, for the first time, of Sol. Sol. The boy appeared from the hallway. Socks. No shoes. The stuffed animal under one arm. He looked at Veyron. Veyron looked at him. And Sol, 4 years and 6 months old now, precise about his preferences and unhurried about his feelings, said one word. Dada. The same word as the gala floor. The same 2 syllables that had stopped a room of 300 people. Here it stopped nothing. Here it just landed, soft and specific, into the quiet of a small apartment with rain on the windows. Veyron crouched down. At eye level with Sol. Hey, he said. Hey, Sol said. Sol held out the stuffed animal, the one with the missing button eye, and pressed it briefly into Veyron's hand, then took it back. This was not an offer. This was an introduction. Sol did this with things he considered important. He showed them to you so you understood what mattered. Veyron understood. You could see it in his face. The way his expression moved through something that had no single name. Grief for what had been missed, tenderness for what was in front of him, the particular quality of arriving somewhere after a very long road and understanding that arrival is its own kind of beginning. He stood, looked at Nyel. I'm not here to negotiate, he said. I'm not here to make a case. I'm not here with a plan. I know, Nyel said. Veyron stopped, looked at the rain on the window, looked back. I wanted you to see that I'm the same outside of it. The building, the lawyers, the statements. This is, he gestured at himself, slightly. This is the same as all of that. Nyel studied him. He had spent 6 months inside his own head with this, turning it over, looking at it from every angle his particular brand of careful attention could find. He had thought about the note with the wrong pronoun, the stairs at 4 in the morning, the bus, the trees. He had thought about a man who lost $300 million without hesitation because the right thing required it. He had thought about what it meant to be seen, truly seen, not by 300 people at a gala and not by a news cycle and not by a legal document, by one person who had knelt on a marble floor and waited in the rain. The tea is almost ready, Nyel said. Something moved across Veyron's face. Not quite a smile. Something better, relief maybe. The specific relief of being let into a room you weren't sure would open. He sat down at the kitchen table. Sol climbed into the chair across from him without being asked, the way Sol always climbed into chairs. He pulled his fish drawing toward himself and studied it. Added a scale. Moved on. Nyel poured 3 mugs. Set them on the table. Sat down. The rain tapped the window. Even. Unhurried. Sol picked up the blue crayon. Added a fin. None of them spoke for a while. And that was the thing, the specific, unremarkable, beautiful thing, that the previous 14 years had never given Nyel. Not the protection. Not the apartment or the security escort or the tea that someone else had bought. Not the number 99. This. 3 people at a table. Rain on the window. A child drawing fish with scales. A mug going warm between his hands. No one needing him to be smaller than he was. That was the whole world. Right there. And it was not bigger than the one he'd had before. Not more impressive, not louder. Not lined with marble or lit by chandeliers that cost more than 4 years of his life. It was just enough. More than enough. Full. He had spent 14 years living a life compressed into the exact dimensions of what was safe. And what he had learned, sitting at this table in the rain, was that compression was not the same as survival. It was a tool. A necessary one, in the years when survival was the ceiling and anything above it was not an option you were permitted to want. He did not need to be ashamed of it. The compression had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had kept them fed and housed and medicated and together. It had kept Sol in train books and Nyel in scent patches and both of them moving forward through the version of the world they had been handed. But tools change when conditions change. The compression was done now. The door that had opened at Arkavale Tower, the executive one, the one with the brushed chrome handles and the crest above the frame, the one that had beeped 3 times and gone green for a small boy in white sneakers who had walked through it like he had always expected it to open. That door had not closed behind them. It was still open. And Nyel was on the other side of it. Not hiding. Not managing distances. Not eating leftover catering food in hallways and teaching a child to keep his voice down in rich spaces. Just present. At a table. With tea. With a man who had driven through the rain without guards. With a boy who was adding the final scale to a fish that had taken 6 months to complete. The door that had opened at Arkavale Tower. The executive one. The one with the brushed chrome handles. The one that had beeped 3 times and gone green for a 4-year-old boy who had walked through it like he'd always known it would open. That door was still open. And Nyel was still on the other side of it. Not hiding. Not managing the right distances. Just there. Sol looked up from the drawing. Looked at Veyron. Looked at Nyel. Looked back at the drawing. Added one final scale. Sat back. Decided the fish was complete. It was. Nothing about that world had become bigger. Nyel just stopped living it alone. If this story moved you, if you saw something of your own struggle in Nyel's 14 years of careful math, or in Sol's patient certainty, or in the moment a man waited in the rain rather than demanded entry, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your words reach other people who need to hear that survival is not the ceiling. That the compressed life can open. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that was built to stay with you. Every week there is another life, another choice, another door that beeped green when no one expected it to. Share this with someone who needs it today, and come back, because the next story starts where you least expect it, and it will not let you go.